G'day, Lockie here. So about a week ago, the ACS Engine team dropped this new feature which was to enable private clusters. And what that means is that the Kubernetes API is not actually accessible via the public internet, which leaves you with a couple of different ways to access. But what I really wanted to talk about was people then came and asked me, hey, how do I make sure that all the load balancers, so services of type load balancer, are actually all internal? Now, there are a couple of ways you can do this in Kubernetes, but what I wanted to focus on today was looking at external webhooks. So if you are familiar with a few releases of Kubernetes, so admission controllers and admission plugins were actually defined on the as flags on the API server. And they were actually compiled into the core code base of Kubernetes. But with external webhooks, we can actually build external admission controllers and register them with Kubernetes dynamically. So I no longer need to get my code into, for whatever logic I want for my admission controllers into core Kubernetes. I can build and have it on the fly. So this is great value. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I want to just pop over to the documentation. Everything you'll find here is about external admission webhooks. So this is looking at extensible admission controllers. Now this, I have actually built everything on 1.8 at the moment. There are some changes to 1.9 that I will look at soon. But admission webhooks in 1.8 are not mutable or mutatable. So that means every resource that is submitted to the controller cannot be modified or patched. Now in 1.9 that actually changes, but today what I've actually built is a webhook controller that takes a look at services and makes sure they have the correct annotations to determine that they are an internal load balancer. So this should be great, but know that you need to enable admission control. It's not on, it's disabled by default. You need to add it to your admission controller flag, and you actually need a runtime config both on your API server or n number of API servers, and they all need to be restarted. Okay, so let's dig in. Before I actually dig in, the work that I've done is based on the upstream examples. So kudos to the folks who actually worked on these different examples. So I've actually been able to take them and modify them, but I think it deserves a call out to say that I love having workable examples, and it made it really easy for me to code one up and show you how that's going to work. Now finally, upstream documentation, internal load balancers. So all the big public clouds have this annotation which determines whether they're an internal or external. So I, working for Microsoft, have done the Azure for now, but I encourage you, it's open source. I have built this webhook load balancer, webhook admission controller here. Feel free to actually upstream if you want to make it reconfigurable. I think that would be great. So the code is all open source, but I think, aside from that, I really want to get into how this works. So let me just pop over here. So let me just give you functionally how it works and the pieces that make it up. So I have a service, and if I type it, probably get service. So first of all, actually, this is an ACS engine cluster. And kubectl version, it should be 1.8.8, okay, as mentioned. So I've created a service and a pod and deployed them. So I have this service called internal LB webhook admission controller, and I have a pod, and that endpoint should be attached, so that pod attached to that service. Let's take a look at that. Okay, so we can see that I have an endpoint attached to that service. So that's all up and running. Now, one other piece here to this, and we have an example here, is so we actually enable this new API and we create an external admission hook configuration. Now, what this tells the API server is when to send and what to send to the external webhook admission controller. And what I'm actually configuring here, actually I'll show you what I have running on the cluster rather than in there, kubectl get external admission hook configuration. So I have one there. I'm going to pipe that out and show you what I have. So what I have here is it looks very similar to a role binding. So I have an API version The operations, which essentially are the verbs, create an update on services. So any services that are created or updated, I'm going to send to this webhook controller, admission controller, to get a yes or no as to whether this will be allowed. And then what you also do is bind it to a service, right? So I'm saying in the default namespace, bind it to this service. I'm using self-signed certificates with different CAs, so I've got a certificate there for the CA. And this is another important thing, failure policy. So if I can't get to the admission controller or it doesn't respond, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to fail the operation? So I think failure policy is fail or ignore. I have it set to ignore, so if it doesn't get a response, it will still, that resource creation or update will still get pushed into the API server. Right, so, but that is all mechanical background, how it operates, right? So as a user, I want to create a service, right? So I have no services here. So kubectl create service, and let's do a help here because, and I want to do a cluster IP. I'll give it a name, my service cluster IP, and I believe it needs a port. We'll say it's port 80. Nope, I got it wrong. So let's go take a look. TCP, okay, unknown flag, and it looks like TCP. Okay, so I've created a service, nothing new there, nothing new there. Now why is this? Because in my source code, which I can pop over to the end, I'm only matching actually services of type load balancer because that's all I'm interested in. So nothing has happened here. Let's create, that was a cluster IP service, let's create a load balancer service. Load balancer. Okay, so what is this saying? I've tried to create a service of type load balancer called my service load balancer on port 80. Error from the server. The service annotations do not contain required key or value. That is a generic error message in the source code. So the API server has not actually committed this request to create it because the admission controller has said no. Okay, so how do I actually create a service, right? Let's go over and take a look. So according to the documentation on Azure, I actually need this annotation. It just so happens that I have one pre-warmed here. Right, so I've added this annotation with it true and test. So I would expect that I can create a service of type load balance. So what I'm going to do here is kubectl create. I'm going to feed that in and give it an EOF. Now that was fine. Okay, so because I've created a service of type load balancer with the right annotation, it accepted it. Right, so let's get service, kubectl edit service. Test service. Now I'm just going to play some monkey business here. False, and edit it. Remember, we're looking for creates and updates. This is an update. Now the error messaging is not as nice as it is when we do the create manually, so we get a pretty ugly error there. That has not been persisted. Let's go and add another foo bar. Now that edit was fine, right, because I wasn't manipulating the particular key val that I was looking at. So finally, that's kind of the UX there. Finally, I just want to go over here and take a look at the code very quickly. So basically, I've written with help of a friend, Jack Francis, friend and colleague. He's helped, so he deserves credit for helping me out here. Basically, I'm going in and saying that if you're of type load balancer, then go in and process admit LB, because I'm only interested in load balancer type services, not all the others, so they don't need to go through this loop. They will be admitted irregardless, or regardless, should I say. So I'm gonna, if I pop into this function, you're not allowed, right? And if you actually have the right annotations, then you are allowed. And that's pretty much how it's working under the cover. So we could pull this out, and for the other cloud providers, make this a config map or something else that reads these in on the fly and evaluates all of them. So we could have a generic service annotations evaluator webhook, and based on whatever cloud you're on, you could do that. But that's pretty much it. So this is just one way we could do it. We could do it with initializers. We could actually do mutable in 1.9, so mutatable, I believe. We could actually make it. If that thing doesn't exist, add it and then commit the object through the API server to etcd. So there are a number of ways we can skin this cat, but here is a lightweight way that we can spin up an external webhook in cluster to actually gate whether we would create internal or external load balancers, which is a great addition to a private cluster. So thank you very much for joining. Leave comments or likes if you like this video and it was helpful, and I appreciate you tuning in. Cheers, bye.